From now on, you will hear 3 disturbing stories, anonymously submitted by people who experienced unexplainable events in airports. The Late Night Transit. I never thought I'd be sharing this story, but after seeing similar experiences on this channel, I feel like I need to warn others about what happened to me at Denver International Airport last winter. I was on a business trip, and due to multiple delays and a missed connection, I ended up having to stay overnight for a 6 a.m. flight the next morning. It was around 1:30 a.m. when I decided to head to the airport. I figured I could sleep in one of those comfortable terminal chairs rather than pay for just a few hours at an airport hotel. Looking back, I should have just paid for the room. The airport was eerily quiet when I arrived. Sure, I expected it to be less crowded, but this was different. The massive terminal felt hollow, with only the hum of escalators and the occasional echo of my wheeled suitcase breaking the silence. The security checkpoint was open, but there was only one TSA agent, a tall man, who barely looked at my ID before waving me through. I remember thinking it was strange how he never said a word, just stared straight ahead, as if looking through me. After security, I made my way to Concourse B, where my early morning flight would depart. The underground train was still running, but the automated voice announcing the stops seemed slower than usual, almost distorted. I told myself it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me, but even then, something felt off. The real trouble started when I reached my concourse. I was walking past gate B24 when I first noticed the footsteps. At first, I thought it was just my own echo, but the rhythm was slightly off. When I stopped, the other footsteps continued for 2 more steps before stopping too. My heart started racing, but I convinced myself I was just being paranoid. I kept walking, this time more quickly. The footsteps behind me picked up pace too. I could hear them clearly now, harder, more deliberate than my own. I didn't want to look back. Every instinct told me not to, but I couldn't help myself. When I turned around, the corridor behind me was empty. But there, about 50 feet back, one of the digital departure boards suddenly flickered and went dark. I practically ran to my gate area, B38, which I knew would have more seating and hopefully better lighting. When I got there, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a single airport employee sitting behind the counter, but they were slumped forward, completely still. I couldn't see their face, but their uniform looked wrong somehow. The colors seemed faded, almost gray in the fluorescent lighting. I called out, "Excuse me?" My voice echoed through the empty terminal. The figure didn't move. I took a step closer, and that's when I noticed their name tag was blank. Just a white piece of plastic with no name, no airline logo. Another step closer, and I could hear a sound, a low, wet breathing, coming from the slumped figure. Before I could process what was happening, the overhead lights in the gate area began shutting off one by one, creating a wave of darkness moving toward me. I grabbed my suitcase and ran. I didn't care how crazy I looked anymore. Every instinct was screaming at me to get out of there. I ran back toward the train station, but when I got there, the platform was completely dark. The train's display showed it was out of service, which made no sense given that the airport never fully shuts down. I could hear those footsteps again, closer now, accompanied by what sounded like someone dragging something heavy across the floor. That's when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Denver International Airport information. My hands were shaking as I answered it, but there was no voice on the other end, just the sound of that same wet breathing I'd heard from the figure at the gate. I took the emergency stairs running up the 4 flights to the main level. By some miracle, I saw a security guard near the exit, a real one this time, looking alive and normal in his properly colored uniform. When I told him what happened, he radioed it in and had another guard escort me to the public area. They did a sweep of Concourse B, but found nothing unusual. The gate agent I described wasn't there, and all the departure boards were working normally. I waited in the main terminal until dawn, surrounded by early morning travelers and airport staff. When I checked the security footage later with the airport police, the cameras showed me walking alone through an empty but normally lit terminal. There was no slumped figure at B38, no flickering lights, nothing unusual at all. But I know what I experienced. The police eventually concluded that I had probably been sleepwalking or hallucinating from exhaustion. Maybe they're right. But here's the thing. Last week I was looking through Denver Airport's staff records for an unrelated work project, and I found something that still keeps me up at night. In 1998, a gate agent working the overnight shift at B38 had been found dead at her post, slumped over the desk. The cause of death was listed as a brain aneurysm. They said she had been dead for hours before anyone noticed, sitting there in the early morning darkness as passengers walked past, everyone too tired or too busy to realize something was wrong. This happened to me about 8 months ago at an airport in southeastern Europe. I'm keeping the exact location vague for obvious reasons, but I need to share this story as a warning to other solo travelers. I was heading home after a 2-week backpacking trip. My flight was scheduled for 11 p.m., and I arrived at the airport around 8:30, wanting to give myself plenty of time since I barely spoke the local language. The terminal was this massive Soviet-era building, all concrete and harsh lighting. Only about half of the overhead lights were working, creating weird shadows everywhere. The problem started at check-in. None of the signs were in English, and my flight wasn't showing up on any of the boards. I approached what looked like an information desk, where a middle-aged woman in an ill-fitting uniform was typing on an ancient computer. When I showed her my ticket, she frowned and started rapidly speaking in her language, while pointing to a corridor I hadn't noticed before. I tried using Google Translate on my phone, but the airport's Wi-Fi wasn't working, and I had no cellular data left. Not knowing what else to do, I followed her directions down the corridor. It branched off into 2 sections, and I noticed that one of them had a sign with an airplane symbol and an arrow. That seemed promising, so I took that path. Looking back, I should have realized something was wrong when I didn't see any other passengers around. The corridor led me to what looked like a security checkpoint, but it was different from any I'd seen before. Instead of the usual metal detectors and X-ray machines, there was just a single desk with 2 men in dark blue uniforms. They weren't wearing any official airport badges or identification. When they saw me, they quickly stood up and started speaking to each other in hushed tones. One of them, a tall man with a scarred eyebrow, gestured for my passport. His hands were covered in what looked like industrial-grade rubber gloves, the kind used for handling hazardous materials. I hesitated, but he stepped forward and grabbed my passport anyway. While he flipped through it, the other man walked behind me and closed the heavy metal door I had come through. The sound of it latching echoed through the corridor. The man with my passport made a phone call, speaking quickly in the local language. I caught what sounded like numbers being repeated, maybe coordinates or some kind of code. His partner kept staring at me with this unervingly blank expression, occasionally glancing at a small door behind their desk that I hadn't noticed before. Through its window, I could see another corridor, dimly lit with red emergency lights. That's when I noticed something else. There was a security camera in the corner, but its red recording light was off. I also realized I couldn't hear any of the usual airport sounds anymore. No announcements, no distant conversations, nothing. Just the hum of fluorescent lights and my own increasingly rapid breathing. The man on the phone finished his call and said something to his partner, who nodded and pulled out a handheld radio. As he spoke into it, I heard quick footsteps approaching from the red-lit corridor. The small door opened and 2 more men entered, wearing similar uniforms but with white medical masks. One was carrying what looked like zip ties. My heart was pounding now. I remembered reading about human trafficking rings operating through Eastern European airports, targeting solo travelers. The stories usually mentioned unofficial checkpoints and staff without proper identification, exactly like what I was seeing now. I glanced at the exit door behind me. The second guard noticed and took a step closer, positioning himself between me and the door. The man with my passport started writing something on a form. I could see it wasn't any official airport document. It looked more like a shipping manifest with boxes for weight and dimensions. In that moment, pure survival instinct kicked in. I remembered the self-defense keychain my sister had given me before the trip, a small but loud personal alarm. Without thinking twice, I pulled it from my pocket and activated it. The high-pitched shriek echoed off the concrete walls, startling the men. In their moment of confusion, I lunged forward, grabbed my passport from the desk, and slammed my shoulder into the emergency exit bar behind me. The door opened into a brightly lit main terminal area, but not the one I'd come from. This was clearly the active part of the airport, with actual travelers and legitimate security personnel. Behind me, I heard shouting and footsteps, but they stopped abruptly as I entered the public space. When I looked back, the men were gone, retreating into their shadowy corridor. I ran to the nearest official-looking security desk, where I found a guard who spoke English. He radioed for assistance while I explained what happened. Within minutes, several armed police officers arrived. They took my statement and investigated the corridor, but by then, the men were long gone. The checkpoint area looked completely different under proper lighting, just an abandoned section of the old terminal that was supposed to be sealed off for renovation. The police found evidence that someone had been using that section recently, cigarette butts, fresh footprints, and, disturbingly, several passports hidden in a desk drawer. They launched an investigation, and I later learned they uncovered a human trafficking operation that had been working out of several airports in the region. They had been posing as airport security, targeting travelers who looked lost or didn't speak the language. I made it onto a different flight home the next day, but that experience changed how I travel forever. I always research airports thoroughly now, memorize their layouts, and most importantly, never follow directions to unmarked or secondary security checkpoints, no matter who gives them. There are real predators out there, and they're counting on travelers being too polite or too confused to question things that don't feel right. I've been a flight attendant for 6 years, so I'm used to all sorts of weird situations in airports. But what happened at Chicago O'Hare 3 months ago still makes me question whether I should keep flying at all. It was around 2 when our flight landed. We'd been delayed due to bad weather in Dallas, and most passengers were either sleeping or irritable by the time we reached baggage claim. I usually carry just a carry-on, but I'd been gone for 5 days and had checked a bag, a black Samsonite hard case, pretty common. The baggage claim area was mostly empty, except for our flight's passengers. The fluorescent lights were flickering slightly, creating that weird effect where everything looks like it's moving in slow motion. I was exhausted and just wanted to grab my bag and get to my crash pad near the airport. When my bag came around on the carousel, something felt off about it. The weight was slightly different, and there was a faint smell coming from it, something metallic, like copper. I checked the luggage tag, and it matched my information perfectly. Even had my crew tag on it, but something still didn't feel right. I wheeled the suitcase to a quiet corner near the water fountains and unzipped it just enough to peek inside. The smell got stronger, and I immediately noticed these weren't my clothes. Instead of my neatly folded uniforms, I saw what looked like dirty work clothes, dark stained coveralls and heavy boots. There was something wrapped in plastic at the bottom of the bag, partially covered by the clothes. Before I could investigate further, I heard footsteps approaching. Looking up, I saw a man in an airport maintenance uniform walking directly toward me. He was tall, probably in his 50s, with calloused hands and dark stains on his uniform that matched the ones on the coveralls in the suitcase. His employee badge was turned backward, and he was wearing thick work gloves despite being indoors. "That's my bag," he said quietly, his voice hoarse. "There's been a mix-up." He reached for the suitcase, but I pulled it back. I'd dealt with enough confused passengers to know proper procedure. "Sir, this bag has my name and crew tag on it," I explained, trying to sound professional despite my growing unease. "We should check with baggage services to find yours." His expression changed then, just slightly, but enough to make my skin crawl. A small smile appeared at the corners of his mouth as he glanced around the nearly empty baggage claim area. "No," he said, "that's definitely my bag, and I'm going to need it back now." My flight attendant training kicked in, the part where they teach us to trust our instincts about suspicious behavior. I took a step back, pulling the suitcase with me. That's when I noticed something else about him. His boots were leaving faint reddish marks on the tile floor. Without another word, I turned and quickly walked toward the escalators, where I knew there would be security. I could hear his footsteps behind me, getting faster. I didn't run. Running in an airport tends to cause panic and brings the wrong kind of attention. Instead, I walked as quickly as I could, pulling the suitcase while reaching for my phone. The escalators were out of service for the night, blocked by yellow maintenance barriers. I headed for the stairs instead, my heels clicking on the tile floor. The sound echoed through the empty terminal, along with his increasingly rapid footsteps. I glanced back and saw him talking into a radio, his eyes never leaving me. 2 more maintenance workers appeared at the top of the stairs, wearing the same kind of gloves. They started walking down, trying to look casual, but clearly positioning themselves to cut off my escape route. I looked around frantically and spotted the service corridor that we flight crews sometimes use. It led directly to the terminal security office. I swiped my crew ID and yanked the door open, practically throwing myself and the suitcase inside. As the door clicked shut behind me, I heard the man shout something to his colleagues. The service corridor was dimly lit by emergency lights, and I could see the security office door at the end, maybe 50 feet away. I was halfway there when I heard the service door open behind me. At that moment, my foot caught on something and I stumbled, losing my grip on the suitcase. It fell and burst open on impact. In the dim red light, I saw what had been wrapped in plastic, bloody maintenance uniforms and what looked like surgical tools, all coated in something dark and wet. Pure adrenaline took over. I left the suitcase and ran for the security office. I could hear them right behind me now, their boots heavy on the concrete floor. I reached the office door, grabbed the handle, and nearly cried with relief when it opened. 2 airport police officers were inside, watching security monitors. They reacted immediately when they saw my face. Within seconds, they had their weapons drawn and were rushing past me into the corridor. But by the time they got there, the maintenance men were gone. The suitcase was still lying open on the floor, but now it contained only my clothes, neatly folded, exactly as I had packed them. The police searched the entire terminal. They found no sign of the men, and the security cameras showed no maintenance workers in the baggage claim area during that time period, just me, walking alone, acting strangely with my suitcase. The officers suggested that fatigue was playing tricks on my mind, but they took a report anyway. A week later, I was deadheading back to Chicago when I overheard 2 gate agents discussing some recent renovations at O'Hare. Apparently, while doing work in an old maintenance tunnel, they found evidence of something horrible. I couldn't catch all the details, but I heard enough. Multiple garbage bags, surgical implements, and airport maintenance uniforms. The investigation is still ongoing, but they've linked DNA evidence to 3 cold cases, all airport employees, who had disappeared over the past year after late-night shifts. Each time, the security cameras had mysteriously malfunctioned, and the only evidence was their cars left in the employee parking lot. I still fly through O'Hare sometimes. It's unavoidable in my job. But I never check bags anymore, and I don't walk through that terminal alone at night. Sometimes when I'm passing through baggage claim, I catch a whiff of that metallic smell, and I wonder how many other suitcases have been switched and switched back, their horrific contents temporarily borrowed by someone who knew exactly how to exploit the chaos of a busy airport.